So, good morning. This is ICUJP for Friday morning, June 21st. And I'm Rick. I'm the social media and communications director. Thank you all for joining us. As we go, we're going to get some more people joining us, probably because they need caffeine or something before they actually hit the share screen part of Zoom.
Good morning, everybody. Steve Rohde, proud to be chair of this wonderful group, ICUJP, that has been at this for almost 23 years, holding over 1,000 webinars every Friday during that period. I personally am also active with the ACLU, Bend the Arc, a Jewish Partnership for Justice, the Black Jewish Justice Alliance, and Death Penalty Focus. I love the notion of getting peace books into the libraries. And I always thought the phrase, "thank you for your service," should be much broader than folks who only serve in the military. And I thank everyone on this screen for your service to the best ideals of America. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I was thinking we should also say that to pretty much every librarian out there as well. We also have a few different things that I wanted to talk about. I'm posting in the chat a link tree, which is basically a whole bunch of different resources for the organization. You can click on that and find out a whole bunch of different stuff that we're doing, including Norman Solomon, a link to Norman Solomon's book, War Made Invisible, links to other writings and documentaries that some of our speakers have had. You can even hear a playlist on Spotify called "We Insist: Jazz, R&B, and Social Justice." I put it together, so it is really good. And also, there is a page on Eventbrite where if you'd like to support ICJP's ongoing work, we've been doing this for almost 23 years. You can do that, and you can use PayPal to do that on Eventbrite. You can use Google Wallet or Apple Wallet. We also have a link on the ICUJP main website that you can do that as well. And we really appreciate it. The last few years with coming out of the COVID pandemic has been very hard on a lot of different groups. And I think what a lot of organizations are finding out is that when you're trying to go out in public again and do some of these programs in various venues as opposed to on Zoom, you forget about the costs incurred. You know, sometimes you're paying for a room, sometimes you're paying for supplies to do stuff, like even print paper is really expensive. So anything that you can give on the ICUJP website, you can do monthly payments. On Eventbrite, you can do it on PayPal. We really appreciate that kind of help. So thank you very much. This is about the time we have a reflection from somebody in order to set the tone for the meeting. And this morning we have a reflection from Maggie Hutchison. So please, Maggie, the floor is yours.
I knew that I was going to do this when I left on my vacation on the 2nd of May. And, you know, I took notes about my reactions to everything. It could be called reflections on my conversations with Uber drivers. Because I left on the 2nd of May and I got back last night. The Uber driver that I spoke to in New York was he was an asylee, and he had come from Afghanistan by way of, he came from Turkey, and he's Turkish, but he went to Afghanistan to serve in the army there, and somehow was able to get asylum status. And he was the one person who was the most thrilled with his life. He so appreciated being here, and that his son, who is deaf, and he who is deaf, they're getting treatment and services in Buffalo, New York, and he's able to be in reserved army, and he's thrilled with everything that's going on in his life. The other Ubers are losing a lot of money. We pay $21.62 and they get $4. And it seems like a terrible, terrible, they feel very, what's the word? Abused by the system. But I started off my conversation with the Uber driver. Oh, I was going to set my timer so that I would know. Of course, now it won't set. Yes, okay. So the conversation, I started off in a very active listening, appropriate way by saying, I'm really thrilled that Donald Trump was considered guilty on 34 charges. And he said, well, I'm not. I don't like Biden because he's letting all those evil people come over the border. So, but we made friends. I asked him about his family and what the progress that his family has made. And he's really appreciates being here. And I got to know him. And that's, I think, one of the things that I am trying to do in my life, which is, really to keep in mind the St. Francis prayer. Make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we're born to eternal life. So my trip, I'm just going to go through the itinerary and tell you what I've done. And I can't figure out whether I was trying to see everybody that I've loved in my life in a 1 6-week period, or whether I was trying to escape from so many things. The garage is just a very small part of it. I feel I can't move forward with my life until that garage has been cleaned out, and the books and memorabilia and all that. So that is certainly a part of the escape thing. But also, I mean, we are a group of people who doesn't believe in endless war. And we're seeing it being part of the survival of this country, part of our whole MO, really. And so I don't know whether I was trying to escape or trying to engage with the people that I've loved throughout my life. And I went to see my nephew, who I've asked you to pray for, Carl, who is a chaplain who was in a terrible motorcycle accident. I went to Portland to see my boyfriend. I went to Ojai to see my friend who's my age, who's in a wheelchair. I went to, and bedridden. I went to Fullerton to see a friend. Then I went to Detroit. And on the way to Detroit, I stopped at Midway, and there was a chapel there run by a chaplain. And he was talking about the different religions that come and worship in that chapel in the airport. And there was a man who stood up and said, but what did they call God? And he left in anger because there had been Muslims and Jews also worshiping in the same room. So we prayed for him in that chapel service. Then I went to Buffalo to take a bus to go to a workshop on Road Scholar workshop on the topic of foreign policy in the Middle East and various other places, hearing about what the ambassadors are doing in the different embassies. Okay, so I'm down to the last minute. So in Niagara Falls, in Buffalo, I took another Uber ride, and we went to Niagara Falls. And I just spent the day there. I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's a Grand Canyon kind of experience as well. And all of the worries that I had about losing things and not being able to do my garage and not being able to change the political climate, seeing, two candidates who are not for peace running up against each other, it kind of went away. I felt so much peace by being there amongst the grandeur of the Grand Canyon. I went from there to from the Rhodes Scholar thing in Chautauqua. I went to visit my friend who I've known for 60 years, since we were both working on the civil rights movement in 1964. And then from there, I went to see my daughter and her four children in DeLand, Florida. So, and I got a few mosquito bites, which was no fun. But other than that, I did, the question that I was looking at was, am I accepting my diminishments as part of life? Well, when I lost my CPAP machine on the way back, I did have a moment of acceptance, and I walked up to a guy with a wheelchair and I said, in 10 minutes, I've got to be on that plane, but I don't know where my equipment is. So he rolled me back, and I gave him a little gratuity. And I just was so glad that had happened right there. I do feel that problem solving is not my forte, but we were able to solve that problem in about 5 minutes. And I made it to the final. That was my last airplane flight. I went on 13 flights. I was not environmentally good, but I really discovered both the desire to escape and also look at what am I supposed to do with the rest of my life. I'm 78, but I'm not the same as I was when I was 28. So I see people graciously accepting their diminishments, but and I see some people in this group who don't diminish, and I want to be just like that, but I've got to be willing to accept something in between. So thanks for letting me share that. I will never do a reflection again. I just want to let you know that.
That was great. That was very, very good. You had me thinking a little bit about, I think it was Audubon was talking about the idea of sauntering, and the word comes from a spiritual journey. And so, if you think about, he said, hiking is not a good word. It's a saunter. It's a way to be able to be in touch with the creator on your own terms and their own terms. So it's something to think about. That was really, really good. Thank you, Maggie. I think we can go into our topic for today. And that comes from our speaker, Norman Solomon, who has a new book, or new as in the last year, I guess, War Made Invisible. And the full title is War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And this is, something that's happened because we become more and more sophisticated about how we wage war and how we market it. And I think if you know, kind of push back on the term marketing, you really don't understand how politics um, and capitalism work. It's all marketing. It just depends on how you're going to be the most receptive to it. And I think ever since the 60s and the Vietnam War, uh, government has been a lot more sophisticated about how they tell people that people are dying in their name in another country. And to speak to us about that and several other topics is Norman Solomon, who is a journalist, media critic, author, and activist. And War Made Invisible was published by New Press in June 2023 and has written about a dozen other books, including War Made Easy: How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. And Norman is the founder of the Institute for Public Accuracy, a consortium of policy researchers and analysts. And he's the IPA's executive director and the coordinator of its ExposeFacts program. And he is also co-founder and national director of rootsaction.org, which has 1.3 million online supporters, and was a Bernie Sanders delegate to the 2016 and 2020 Democratic National Conventions, and has done a lot of work in this action for many, many years. And we look very, very much forward to hearing from Norman. If everybody else can go on mute, and Mr. Solomon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Rick, and thanks to everybody for making our gathering possible here. I'm going to talk for a bit, and I think we'll have some questions and comments, which I look forward to very much. Actually, look forward to more than hearing myself talk by far. I often think of something that is one of the least known statements from Martin Luther King Jr. when he said that power without love is often calloused and brutal, and love without power is anemic. And we see that played out continually as we live in the warfare state of 2024. We see what power that is unresponsive to humanity is doing, and we see that love flourishes but rarely galvanizes the kind of power, legitimate power, that's necessary to counter the kind of institutional brutality, racism, militarism, and injustice that's all around us. The challenge that we're facing, the 20 or so of us, and that humanity is really facing, is how to be present with ourselves, present with the rest of the people on the planet in a way that is constructive. I often think of, I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who wrote about the need for community, and that in the face of repression and institutional cruelty, that community is essential. And of course, media and politics as it prevails is antithetical to genuine community, antithetical to nonviolent resistance. We know that the system understands violence because it is inherently violent, whether it's mass incarceration or whether it's military intervention. My book, War Made Easy, which came out, almost 20 years ago, was something I wrote in the wake of the invasion of Iraq. And in recent years, as I thought about what has been transpiring so far in this century, I decided to write another book to try to capture that in terms of war, in terms of militarism, in terms of media and culture and politics in the United States. And at first, I thought, well, I'd call the new book More War Made Easy. But I ended up with the title War Made Invisible because of the ways in which, through the evolution and evolution of war in this country, the wars that the US has been engaged in have become less and less visible for a lot of reasons, including that when the wars have persisted, they become a sort of a white noise. They blend into the wallpaper of the media echo chamber. And of course, they become more mechanized, they become more automated. The drone wars, a reliance on technology, the hubris and arrogance that justly condemns packing explosives into a car and engaging in suicide bombing, glorifies warfare from many thousands of feet in the air. And more, that's where we are. The warfare that, of course, is done in our names with our tax dollars is either unmentioned or euphemized. We are encouraged to believe, and this has been true since the Vietnam War. You may remember when television was the main means of communication, the idea, the trope that TV brought war into people's living rooms, which is absurd. Can you think of anything less like war, like being in a war zone than being in a living room, watching a stable piece of furniture? And as time has gone on, some of that conceit has continued. Now we're told that war is brought to us on our smartphones. This is so detached from reality, and yet it often acculturates us to accept it. The War Made Invisible book really breaks down some of the ways that wars are perpetuated and made invisible in a country that is, as Dr. King said in 1967, still the most violent nation in the world. And the fact that it's hidden from the population doesn't change that in one iota. I talk about in the book how repetition and omission are crucial to the propaganda of war, what we hear about all the time, what is rarely mentioned. The concept or the idea that we are not killing people intentionally is another psychological and political out, because when something is predictable and inevitable, the intent or the alleged intent, the supposed intent becomes very secondary. And I drew heavily on the work of the Costs of War Project at Brown University, which documented since the beginning of the US so-called War on Terror in October of 2001, about 400,000 civilians have directly been killed. About 950,000 people directly have died, and 4.5 million people have been killed directly and indirectly. This is information that's rarely dealt with in the US news media or in the politics of the country. When I've been working in the last few months on an afterword for the paperback edition of War Made Invisible, which is coming out in early September, I had this challenge to be monitoring the news and trying to sort out. I only have 30 pages for book pages to try to summarize it. What will be most meaningful in 6 months or a year or 10 years from now, if we're still here on the planet, to understand about the Gaza war. And I found that really a lot of the basic paradigms and techniques for media manipulation, for hiding the realities of war and justifying the US role in war, whether it's the invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq, or the bombing of Libya and so many other interventions in the last 2 decades, or whether it's the Israeli slaughter of Palestinian people that is now in its 9th month, a lot of those same patterns have been very similar. The omission that is so routine as a form of propaganda. I quote in the book something from Aldous Huxley, who said essentially that lies are powerful, but even more powerful is silence about truth. What we don't hear, what we don't have conveyed to us is really the essence of war, and the belief that media and political discourse convey to us what war is itself a way of further distancing us, numbing us, and diluting us into what war is. And then the ultimate violence of thermonuclear war is avoided or euphemized routinely. I think of the State of the Union speech that President Biden gave in the early autumn of 2001. And he said that for the first time in 20 plus years, the United States was, he said, no longer at war because the US had withdrawn its troops at last from Afghanistan. And so the US, he said, was no longer, had turned the page and was no longer at war. Not to put too fine a point on that, but it was a complete lie. The Cost of War Project at Brown University at the same time, September of 2021, had documented that the US was engaged in counterinsurgency in 85 countries. Of course, had been bombing and continued to bomb several countries as it has since then. You may have noticed when the Houthis were bombing ships in the Red Sea a few months ago, the US launched missiles at Syria and Iraq, and then the Iraqi government said, you didn't even inform us. You bomb our country, you didn't even tell us ahead of time. We're supposedly allies. And the US responded, well, we have every right to bomb Iraq. So that's 20 years after the invasion. The US is still asserting the prerogative to send missiles into the country of Iraq. And then when we think of the State of the Union address in the last iteration, and I should mention that the speech I referred to in September 2021, that was actually to the United Nations, but the one that Biden gave in March of this year, and the one 2 years before that, completely checked out about the dangers of nuclear war, pretending that those dangers don't exist, which is another powerful paradigm for omission, a way of numbing people, a way of lying to people, in effect. If you look at the text of the speech that Biden gave, his first State of the Union address, very shortly after the terrible, illegal, immoral Russian invasion of Ukraine, you find in that first State of the Union address from Biden more than 6,000 words. And not one of them referred to nuclear weapons or nuclear war or the danger of nuclear annihilation on the planet. No mention of nuclear winter. How could that be? That was just very shortly after the Russian invasion and war on Ukraine that greatly spiked upward the dangers of nuclear war. And yet, see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil from the so-called leadership. So to sort of bring it to the present day, and then I'll look forward to questions and comments. We're living in a country that, as much as ever, and in many respects more dangerously for humanity than ever, consistently engages in what Dr. King called the madness of militarism. And not only the denigration of the concepts of diplomacy, a word that has now become a dirty word on Capitol Hill in terms of the Ukraine war, for instance, but enabling mass murder with our tax dollars, with US weaponry of women, men, other civilians in Gaza. And the way in which our own society is accommodating itself to that participation in genocide is deeply instructive and, of course, horrendous. And so I come back to the quote or the paraphrase that I began with from Dr. King. We have plenty of power in this country that is being exercised with tremendous brutality. And we have a lot of love in this country that is not galvanized sufficiently, to put it mildly, to have the kind of what King called the marvelous militancy that is needed through nonviolent action. And I know I'm talking to people who have been engaging in nonviolent action for decades. To be not content is really part of our necessity, and complacency has no place in this world and in this country in particular. So with that, thanks again for the invitation to speak with you, and looking forward to our conversation.
One of the things that we are victims of in this society at this time, I think, is the fact that at one point, people were as sophisticated as the people that were waging war, and we had an understanding that, yeah, well, you need to be cynical. You needed to understand who was talking to you. Go back to the old thing with Watergate and Deep Throat, who follow the money, and who makes money from the war machine. And you had me thinking about a quote from this guy that spoke about 2,000 years ago, the Roman biographer Plutarch. And the poor go to war to fight and die for the delights, riches, and superfluities of others. And yeah, it's true. A lot of you don't see very many weapon executives dying in war. So if we can take questions if you'd like to raise your hand either digitally on the Zoom app, or you can do it biologically and do kind of like this. We can do that. Steve Rhodey, you have a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Norman, so much. I mean, just for this summary, but for all the work you've done for years trying to expose the issues you're talking about. I may have other questions, but yesterday I had the opportunity to interview Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, such a powerful voice. This is for the radio show Law and Disorder. And we focused on a recent article she published about the new AI killing systems known as Lavender and Where's Daddy, that Israel and the United States have joined in developing, that use algorithms and AI systems to target specific individuals and create kill lists. And she related it back to what the CIA has done. It's less technological kill lists in Guatemala and Iran and Latin America and Vietnam. I don't know if you saw her article or are aware of the Lavender and Where's Daddy. The Where's Daddy is so cruel, these names that the military intelligence industrial complex gives things. That one is devoted to finding alleged terrorists in their homes and targeting the kills. So where's daddy is a cruel reference to, where is the father, because the family lives there as well. So I don't know if you have seen reporting on those two systems. And if you could, we have time today, so you can pace yourself to relate a lot of this to this, whatever the technology is, it's used by the CIA and all of these services to keep up the war, but in this case, to keep it hidden. And that's the invisibility, I think, that you're getting at in your book.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. The excellent magazine produced online with great difficulty, Palestinian and Israeli journalists, plus 972, which is the global area code for Palestine. That's where they got the name. They exposed Lavender and Where's Daddy, and they found the documents and the information. And as you're referring to, Stephen, it's horrific, and it's an expression of how technology merged together with a geopolitical agenda and the political economy is so horrific. It's a modern day dystopian use of technology. Like Herbert Marcuse said, the technology depends on the quality of the technology in terms of what it does in the world depends on who controls it. And the Google workers, some of them, have been doing protests earlier this year because of a $1.2 billion, not million, but $1.2 billion contract that Amazon and Google have with the Israeli government. The cloud and data collection and analysis and the algorithms, and the claims notwithstanding to the contrary, those two, I can't say Silicon Valley, Amazon's not in Silicon Valley literally, but Silicon Valley's partnership with the military industrial complex is part of it now, is hugely important. And we had thought of the center of the military industrial complex being manufacturing, being Wall Street, whatever. It's moved to Silicon Valley more and more. And so a company that was founded on the slogan, "Don't be evil," Google, is among many others in that high-tech arena, part and parcel of the whole process. So, okay, that's a tech part of it. And meanwhile, the desensitization, to put it mildly, is more than stunning. It just turns inside out the concepts of what this country is that have been concepts that have been routinely propagated and inculcated. And I think this is part of the process I've been trying to get at in War Made Invisible, the disconnect between what we as a society keep getting messages about of who we are. We know the cliche, that's not who we are, when something is treated as an anomaly. This is not an anomaly. And the disconnect is so great that we live in a country where the filtration system doesn't even allow the information to register for the most part. Often the information barely gets out. But what you're referring to, Stephen, Lavender and so forth, this entire process, and that the United States government is part of this. I mean, we have all these euphemisms in media coverage. Oh, the US is not able to restrain the Israeli government in its killing in Gaza. The US is unable to work its will on Netanyahu and restrain what the Israeli government is doing. This is preposterous. The US government is doing it, is part and parcel. 80% of the Israeli military imports are from the United States. You know, generals have said in the Israeli military, impossible for Israel to do what it's doing without the active support of the US government. And so, I mean, clearly, Donald Trump is fascistic. We have now coming up an election between two militarists and one fascist, which doesn't change the reality that the Biden administration is a part and parcel of the murder machine that is doing what it's doing in Gaza, mass murder machine of genocide.
Vinny Stefano, you had a question.
Thank you. Norman, if I can be so bold as to address you by your first name.
Sure.
There's a bumper sticker that I've seen for years, and it says, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. The reason I mention that is I am in conversation with people all over the planet all the time. And I am surprised, constantly amazed at how grossly misinformed, even well-intentioned, sometimes very educated people are about history. We forget our history, we're condemned to repeat it over and over again. And I'll use Julian Assange as an example, where even committed activists, particularly when they're younger, and I ask them, do you know who Julian is? And they go, no, they don't. Now that's by design. But when we address the Ukrainian war, situation in Gaza, everything is almost situational. Everything happened on May 6th. Nothing occurred before that. How do we overcome that huge chasm of ignorance that I believe is created by design, by the evisceration of our university system and whatnot? How do we find a way to educate people without alienating them?
Well, I think you make a great point, or points, and one of them is that the ability and power to define when history begins is the ability to propagandize. And so no, history didn't begin on October 7th of last year. And the realities of power in our own society are reflected in the power to say what matters and what doesn't. And in media terms, the term retaliation. If you say who's retaliating, then that gives a sort of halo over that particular force. And of course, it's like so much, it's about organizing public education and action. If we do actions and the public, most people don't understand, or few people understand what the underlying issues are, it's difficult to convey. Why would somebody put a hammer to a nose cone of a nuclear weapon? Why would somebody throw blood on a military facility, you know, on and on. So I think it's like walking on two legs, if we're lucky enough to have two legs functioning, is the education and the action, and they go in tandem. And you're reminding me of, at the Institute for Public Accuracy about 5 years ago, we were able to get 535 copies of Daniel Ellsberg's, at that point, new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And Dan Ellsberg wrote personal letters. Dear Congressman Smith, dear Congresswoman Jones, really personal letters, signed them. Here's my book. I hope you'll have a chance to read it. Nuclear winter is verified by scientists. Here's the information. We need to have hearings in Congress. We need to confront this reality. And the other main point of Dan's letter was that ICBMs are the most dangerous nuclear weapons on the planet. And of course, McGregor and others have been working very hard to expose that, going to Vandenberg. Now we have at rootsaction.org, we have a program called Diffuse Nuclear War in coalition with other groups. And we're focusing at diffusenuclearwar.org on ICBMs. So at any rate, the letter was also focusing on the need to shut these land-based missiles down and the land-based part of the nuclear triad. So we're taking the letter around with the book, and I'm going along with others into the offices of the members of the House and Senate and the Capitol and the auxiliary buildings. And I had the experience a number of times of going into the congressional office and the person in front working for the congressperson is there. And I said, well, I have this letter to the congressperson from Daniel Ellsberg. It's a letter and a book. And can you guess what I often heard? I heard, oh, thank you. I'm not familiar with that name, Daniel Ellsberg. This is people who work full time for members of the United States Congress. And it goes to that point. We just have a tremendous amount of work to do to exhume history that's been buried by the military industrial complex.
That's true. Bob Zaw, you had a comment.
I have a question. Actually, I been speaking the last 6 years at Loyola Marymount in classes because I didn't like what Ken Burns had to say about Vietnam, never mentioning draft resistance at all or people in the military battling. So I asked if I could speak, and I went into the class and I would ask how many people were aware of the war in Vietnam. There were 20 people in class, 2 hands went up. And I've been speaking for 6 years, and that's the case every semester. They don't even know about that war. But my question is, one of the things that I would show in class was the Brown-Watson site that shows the deaths of US soldiers versus contractors. And their website has become a big mess. And I can't find the stuff anymore. I'm wondering if you may have the current statistics. What it showed 2 or 3 years ago was that there used to be more US soldiers dying than contractors, and then it shifted. And so the last totals I read were between Afghanistan and Iraq is that 7,000 US soldiers had been killed and 8,000 contractors was the total that had been killed, which allows us to fight a war and hide it from the public because it's being paid for by, retired guys that are on the payroll of Blackwater or whatever companies are doing that. And I don't know where to find those statistics anymore. And do you know what the new statistics are, or did they just stop publishing them?
Well, 8,000 is about the latest. The stats are in War Made Invisible. And I learned a lot about this phenomenon you talked about from Ann Wright, who many of you know, I'm sure, a wonderful activist, whistleblower. And Ann really explained to me how more and more, as you say, Bob, it was contractors. And this is a benefit in many ways to the Pentagon. They don't even count it as deaths. They didn't have to report it as deaths when contractors were killed in Iraq, which is where a lot of the deaths took place. And a lot of these people, uh, when they died, their families had no recourse because the companies weren't going to compensate them or help them, and the Pentagon certainly wasn't going to. It's because you're not working for the government; you're working for the private industry, and so it's a tremendous and very very brutal scam. Just as you say, another way to create more invisibility for these wars.
And Brown is the only place you can get the statistics because the Pentagon.
There are some articles. I have some endnotes in War Made Invisible. There have been occasionally some very good articles in the press, but it goes to that point of repetition and omission. These stories, and we've all seen them in the mass media, they're sometimes good. They're here and they're gone. And it's not an echo chamber, it's just a little blip. And we know that the essence of propaganda is repetition. If we watch a lot of TV, you're not going to see one McDonald's commercial. You're going to see a lot of them. And so this is part of an out for, and we've heard this, and I'm sure a lot of us have experienced this. We'll go to a journalist or an editor and we'll say, well, where's this story? And they'll go and they'll find one story one time and say, oh, we covered it. Yeah, they covered it in a way that they covered it up. They just sort of punched the ticket and it's gone.
Thanks.
It's a very good point. Robert Corsini, you had a comment or question.
Yeah, hi. Norman, fantastic. All this is really engaging. I really appreciate this opportunity. I wanted to say the invisibility of war is it makes me think that we need to reverse that. It needs to be the visibility of war. We need to find ways to project to fill the void in creative, dynamic ways. I remember after, during the Iraq debacle, where I met Stephen Rhodey initially way back, I encountered a guy that was I still keep in touch with him. He created the freeway blogger moniker, right? And I'm sure many of you have seen him. I brought much of his work to progressive places. He found a way to, basically the idea was how to reach 100,000 people for under $1. And the idea was to project the visibility of war onto freeway overpasses with cardboard and stencils. And he distributed probably over the years thousands of messages that has been a consistent presence here in in California overall, because that's really where he does most of his stuff. He still does it. He's a kook, but he's really smart. But the idea of the messaging and making war visible is really interesting. And I think in creative, artful ways, I was just thinking about what you're saying. The Gaza war projected onto buildings at night, taking real video and making it larger than life, might be a way to really look at, again, how to fill the messaging void, because that's the problem. Is as fantastic as your work has been all these years, I mean, you reach a very small audience. We are part of that audience, thankfully, and grateful for the opportunity. But I mean, we're small, and we have to find a way to make it bigger, because the monster out there has control, on all the levers of power here, and it's extraordinary what we're up against. But I think smart ways of messaging is the right way to go. You don't have to buy a page anymore in the New York Times, right? To get your message out, because there is no more New York Times. The other thing I wanted to say is about how to counter the the comprehension of the issues. I've spent time in Israel and Palestine, and I've had an opportunity to see what it is, and I try to communicate that in all my conversations with people, about the horror of what this separation architecture is all about there. And that's part of what's really important to I think to bring to people. It's like we have to go out, get out of our little boxes, and see things for what they really are, kind of in the Plato cave thing, break the chains, see what reality is all about. And that's where you're really going to find, powerful sources for messages. So those are my comments toward you.
Yeah, I think those are those are really important points. And you reminded me of the lyric from a Doors song. They have the guns and we have the numbers. And what do we do with the numbers? I mean, any one of us or any one group of us or organization, we're perhaps like a few grains of sand on the beach, but collectively the potential is there. And of course, everything that we can be proud of in this country is because people organize, and many, many individuals and many, many groups worked at it. So that's sort of the positive way to look at what you rightly pointed out, where it's a David and Goliath thing. We are really up against these monstrous, huge forces. When it comes to the visibility of war, I think it was very instructive to see how the US media have covered the Ukraine war, because when it came to conveying the suffering from the war, the empathetic coverage has been there in overdrive. But when it came to the US war on Iraq, is a whole other story in US media. So that selectivity of conveying the horrors of war is part of the propaganda system,
Mm-hmm.
because when the US does it, there's been, with rare exceptions, very little empathetic or real coverage of the results of an invasion. So it depends on who's doing the invading in terms of the US coverage. I think another note, which I tried to get at in War Made Invisible, is that unfortunately, while it is necessary, it's not sufficient to show suffering from war. I quote Susan Sontag in her book Regarding the Pain of Others, where she points out something that is unfortunate, but I think it rings true. If suffering from war is shown, if the anguish of a soldier who's dying or even of a civilian is depicted, that's not necessarily an anti-war message. It's not necessarily received as such. It can be received as this war is horrible, it should be stopped, or it can be understood as conveying that the war must be ended with victory, that the other side is evil, look what has resulted, and so we need to stick this out and get the job done to get it all finished. And that's where context comes in and the politics of media in general, the way the world is portrayed. And the usual portrayal is that Uncle Sam has a halo over its head. And I don't think we have, or we certainly should not have, any illusion that the US government and military are the only, pardon the expression, evil force in the world. There are other forces of brutality and cruelty and injustice. But the United States military and the US government are the most dangerous forces in the world. The US government is run by people who don't only believe in the Monroe Doctrine. They believe in a Monroe Doctrine for all hemispheres, north, south, east, and west. They believe that China should bend the knee to the United States. They believe that the South China Sea, despite its middle name, should be run by the US Navy, not by the Chinese, who are treated as interlopers in the South China Sea. And so I think the political context is really important, and it's a concentric problem around the portrayal. I mean, I think showing the suffering of war is absolutely crucial because we're so numb to that. It's so avoided in the U.S. media and politics. It's absolutely necessary. Uh, I'm just adding that it's insufficient, and we've got to fight also nonviolently, but we got to fight for a context that can really bring an understanding to what a threat the US military is to human survival on the planet.
Mark Callahan, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks, Norman. Thank you so much. Your work is so important more than ever, and I want to thank you for doing all the work, hard work, and research that you do on behalf of us. Because I wouldn't even know where to begin. But we need you, scholars and activists like you, to help us and to teach us more and more. And that idea of teaching and learning. We're really concerned, so many of us, about our younger generation, and the iPhone technology and how all of our nieces and nephews are just tied to their iPhones, and just 3 minute blurbs, and there's no, and then those of us, or friends of mine who are educators, there's no more critical thinking. There's a dying of critical thinking. So how I'm as fearful of what our younger generation is going to do or not do as any time during war. And what do we do? How do we deal with the fact that younger people just are not being engaged? They're not, and some people say, oh, it's COVID, it's they're learn how they had to cope during COVID, and they were so tied to their computers. But I just don't know what the solution is for younger people who just don't use critical thinking anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're making great points. Listening to you, I thought of the phrase which we have somewhere in our brains. I think freedom is a constant struggle, and the countering of propaganda and trying to bring true information, humanistic perspectives is just, an ongoing challenge. I think early in the computer era, there was the acronym GIGO, right? Garbage in, garbage out. I don't hear that anymore. I wish I heard it more, because we've become, with a lot of encouragement from the Silicon Valley, etc., advertising and imposed mass culture, the idea that technology somehow in and of itself is going to save us. And just that's nonsense. I mentioned earlier about Herbert Marcuse. He pointed this out 50, 60 years ago. You just cannot assume that any technology is going to do anything for you. It depends on who controls it, who is in charge of it. The great scholar and activist Robert McChesney pointed out that the entire history of communications technology has been one iteration after another, the bogus claim that it's going to bring democracy. I mean, you had the most crude telegraphs 2 centuries ago. We're going to democratize society, we were told, people were told. And then there was radio. Radio was going to bring about democracy. We could all communicate. Then it was television. Then it was cable TV. Now it's the internet. And it elides and avoids the question of who's in control, who has the power, who has the economic leverage, how economic power is political power. We're up against the corporatocracy, and the ultimate manifestation will be something like Trumpism, because it gets merged in with xenophobia, the racism, misogyny, nativism. It's picture perfect for a corporate domination, which is in this country approaching 1 trillion with a T dollars a year for overt military spending.
Steve Rohde, you had a question.
Yes. With regard to Ukraine, I'm interested if you agree with this summary that as NATO expanded in Europe, Putin felt threatened. Some have called that a provocation or a justification for Putin's attack on Ukraine. Others believe that while it's a data point, the assault on a sovereign nation was unjustified, and the brutal war that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine is unacceptable. Now people talk about bringing peace to Ukraine by rewarding Russia for its aggression in a peace conference which would cede territory in Ukraine to Russia as the cost for bringing the war to an end. Those are big questions, but I'm very interested in how, in practical terms, with a war going on that the U.S. is supplying military armaments for, and the West and NATO are supporting Ukraine, how does someone like yourself, dedicated to peace, think through the end game for Ukraine in a way that does not reward aggression?
Well, I think you summarized different perspectives really well there. In War Made Invisible, I cite George F. Kennan, who was no peacenik. And he warned that the expansion of NATO under the Bill Clinton administration would be a disaster. As I remember, he said it would be the worst post-World War II foreign policy decision of the United States. From liberal to conservative, there were dozens, and I footnoted in the book, dozens of eminent foreign policy experts within the establishment who wrote to President Clinton, I think this was 1997-ish, and said, don't do this. And of course, he went ahead and did it. And George W. Bush went ahead and did it. And all of these presidents since then have participated in the expansion of NATO. And we know what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know that if the Warsaw Pact expanded to Mexico or Canada, the Washington would have absolutely found it intolerable. All of that NATO expansion was a beginning down that road of what has been going on now. President Biden gave a news conference shortly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he was asked, what do you think about Ukraine joining NATO? And Biden said, oh, well, if they want to join NATO, they have the prerogative to do that. Well, that was really a trigger for this war. I believe if Biden had said, absolutely not, Ukraine should not ever join NATO. It can be a neutral country and it can flourish on that basis. We don't know for sure. The cliche word is counterfactual, but I believe if he had said that, probably the invasion wouldn't have happened. I think NATO expansion is an explanation for why Russia did what it did. It's not a justification. I believe that if we had an international criminal court system that was really an ICC, was really international justice, in the current time, you'd put Netanyahu in the dock, and you would put Putin in the dock, and you probably should put Biden in the dock as well, because he has been part and parcel of the mass murder going on in Gaza. I think that, as in many other realms, we need a single standard of human rights. We don't want in any direction to either participate in or be the flip side of the Orwellian statements coming from people like Biden and Antony Blinken, who go around talking about a rules-based order, when what they really mean is we make the rules and we break the rules. We invade Iraq if we want to, but you can't invade Ukraine. This is just, it's far worse than hypocrisy. It is just a sort of nationalistic megalomania that could drag us into nuclear war.
If I may, as a follow-up to answer the second part of my question, how do we bring peace in Ukraine, and does it reward aggression?
Yeah, that's a key one. Well, I think it's diplomacy. The fact is that diplomacy has become a dirty word on Capitol Hill. You may remember that before the midterm elections, there was a letter from, I think it was 30 or so, 35 members of the Progressive Caucus to Biden saying, we need diplomacy. That they put it, sending weapons isn't enough. I think sending weapons without diplomacy is insane, I think. And that letter said we need diplomacy to end the war in Ukraine. And the blowback was so strong that the Progressive Caucus immediately withdrew the letter. And so that tells us a lot about the climate. I think that diplomacy is going to be key to work it out. And in terms of the last part of your question, I think to some important degree, the concern about rewarding, quote, rewarding aggression, I think it's a misnomer. I mean, it's a very complicated history in terms of Ukraine and the Crimea and Russia and the Soviet Union. And it's going to have to be diplomacy. And the nature of the nature of the beast is that if you don't have diplomacy, you're going to have continual war. I mean, the slaughter going on is horrendous in Ukraine. And the idea that the U.S. is being moral by just shipping more and more weapons, let's you and them fight. the stance, we'll send you the billions of dollars of weapons and we'll keep doing it. And we're the really moral ones, and you keep killing each other. I just think that is unhinged and extremely cruel in the macro level. I think there has to be diplomacy. And as a practical matter, the Ukrainian government's not going to get all that it wants. And it can be argued from here to forever as to how much real estate they should or shouldn't be retaining under Kiev's control. But in the real world, I think that's it's not going to work to fight to the death, because that's what it would be.
We can hear from Rebecca. You had a question or comment?
Yeah, I just had a comment. Thank you very much, Norman. That was very enlightening. It's so frustrating, the lack of critical thinking in our discourse. And I'm listening to a book right now on Audible called The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleiman. He's a founder of DeepMind and Inflector AI. And this book came out before October 7th, but he says in the book that in 2020, during the height of pandemic, when it was, lockdown, that Israel had AI, was already using AI technology, and they were able to assassinate a high-ranking Iranian official in Syria. And it was a pinpoint assassination with the drone. They found him, tracked him, and killed him. And so, immediately I'm thinking, well, why can't they do that with Hamas? They can do that with Hamas, but instead they're getting, bombs, from us that destroy whole blocks. And we know that's what they're going to use these bombs for, even though they could pinpoint, these Hamas, terrorists, even, and just, kill them with more precision if that's what they really intend to do. But so I just don't think we're asking the right questions when we hear about these news reports, like the hostage rescue recently, the rescue where 4 hostages were extracted, but then Hamas is saying now, and it hasn't been verified by anyone, that 3 other hostages were killed. And that the IOF also assassinated on the spot the captors, and they made a point to say that they were one was a physician and one was a Al Jazeera journalist. And so why aren't we questioning, well, why weren't they captured instead and put on trial? I mean, who knows why they were keeping them hostage, and we're not hearing from the hostages themselves about their captors, and were they were they in on this, or did they have a gun to their head by Hamas or the jihad, the Islamic Jihad, or whoever else is involved with keeping the hostages? These questions just aren't being asked, but that's what I would expect if that happened here in the U.S. and somebody was holding someone hostage. They get due process, a fair trial, and we're just accepting that they were killed in the spot, and that was the right thing to do. And just the last comment on the positive spin that is put on us supplying these weapons. I used to work for Harris Corporation in their commercial, one of their commercial divisions. They're a defense contractor, make radio equipment. And it was always, this pride of working with Harris, because we had this equipment that helped our soldiers find like victims in the rubble of 9/11. But yeah, it's like when I talk to my my plan advisor for my retirement accounts, and I say, well, I don't want to invest in any military weapons. She says, but we have to invest in defense. And it just seems like we're just surrounded by there's just this whole idea that, you know, what the US is doing in providing these bombs and weapons is for defense, and not seeing it for what it's really doing. It's for creating war and carnage.
Yeah, thank
So,
you for that. I don't have any problem with supporting defense contractors. I have a problem with supporting military contractors.
mhm.
One of the things I write about in the book is our very language has been taken over by the military-industrial complex. We're told that we need this amount of defense spending, lowercase d, the lowercase d defense budget. It's not a defense budget. It's not defense spending. It's military spending. And that's just another manifestation of how language is filtrated into discourse to have a content. It gives a spin to it. What you're talking about in terms of the deaths and the hostages and so forth, I think is just very significant. As I remember, there was a big ballyhoo about the 4 hostages being rescued, which was a good thing. How many Palestinian people died in the process?
Mhm.
And they got fewer headlines, to put it mildly. I think it was into the hundreds of people. I mean, this is so emblematic of the entire political and media culture of the United States. I have a chapter in War Made Invisible called "Some Lives Really Matter and Some Really Don't." And you have a through line from Vietnam to the present day in terms of U.S. warfare and support for allies doing warfare, and that is a constant theme. Some people really matter, and so underneath that is what I have come to refer to as 2 tiers of grief, TIERS, 2 tiers of grief. The entire planet, in a sense, in terms of warfare, is divided in mass US media and politics between people whose lives matter and people whose lives don't, people whose grief matter and people whose grief don't. If you look at US soldiers, when they leave behind loved ones, their grief really, really matters. Uh, when Ukrainian people die under Russian bombs, their lives, their grief of their loved ones, they really matter in US media and politics, and they should. But what about the Palestinian lives that are basically taken with the direct participation of the US government? So there's the through line from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq and beyond. And part of our challenges, of course, are to say we have one humanity, and we have one tier of grief, and we have one world of human beings.
Mhm.
Well, that's very true. Before we get to Vinny and Robert on their follow, I wanted to make a brief comment. I think one thing that progressives and liberals tend to shy away from is thinking that we have any sort of power to be able to prevent this, aside from numbers, aside from uh, the amount of people that we can coalesce around a certain march or around a certain action. One thing we do have is the ability to, as a mass group of people, control the financial movement of funds into some of these companies. One of the things that AFSC is doing is a project called Divest or Investigate as well, and it's looking at companies that are profiting from the war machine, especially publicly traded companies where you can do some really good manipulation of stock price in a coordinated effort. This happened years ago with Sinclair Broadcasting when they were running a kind of fake documentary on pseudo documentary on a presidential candidate. And I think that's one thing that we can take a look at. Other is to hold account the actual journalists that are reporting on this. What made it clear to us, and one, we were planning on going 1 year to the Society of Professional Journalists convention in San Diego when they were giving their First Amendment award to
Judith Miller.
Judith Miller. Yes. So, I think in ways we can be disruptive and make organizations and make companies a little bit hold them into account a little bit more than we have. Um, we have 3 more hands in about 10, 15 minutes. So, Vinny, you had a follow-up.
Yes, I do. I'll be brief. Dave Clennon just put an excellent post in the chat regarding alternative media. If we quote Dickens, it's the best of times and the worst of times. During the Vietnam War, when Walter Cronkite turned against the war came quickly, not quickly, but it was in a direction to end. The images of soldiers lighting hooches on fire and so forth. Well, right now we've got 6 major media corporations owned by 6 corporations. However, there is a very robust alternative media. I'd like to hear your take on the current media landscape and how we can maximize on those individuals that Dave put in the chat that provide you a platform to speak. How do we amplify those voices?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And by the way, Dave Clennon has been such a great activist for decades, one of the bravest human rights activists in Hollywood for a long, long time. The challenge of building independent alternative media is just, it's ongoing. And I say on the airwaves when I'm on, say, KPFK or KPFA up here in the Bay Area, I say, please don't give your money to National Public Radio. Give it to independent media. Sure, we don't have a lot of money, but what resources we do have, don't give it to National Pentagon Radio. Give it to independent media outlets. And a plus of the internet, of course, there's a lot of pluses and minuses, but the barriers to entry are much less. And increasingly, the web, for better and worse, is the dominant media, or the way that media at least utilize. I mean, the so-called legacy media are using the internet. They tend to dominate the CNNs and the New York Times, but still, we have thousands and thousands of wonderful websites and outlets, video, all different types of media using, and I think many of them are they're desperate for funding. And there's a lot of sweat equity. They make $1 go very far quite often. And it is part of that's sort of the technical medium, but the resources, the human resources, so to speak, the creativity, the energy, the idealism that people have is really going a long way. Still in all, it needs dollars. And that's part of our process. And also to hold ourselves in our independent media to the same standards we would the LA Times or the New York Times.
Yeah. Let's see. So, Maggie, you had a question.
Well, Steve usually asks this question, but we like to hear how you got started in this kind of a path, search for truth and willingness to speak truth to power. How did that start?
Those are the hard kind of questions that for any one of the 20 of us, I think. And by the way, Maggie, thank you for your reflections. And it made me feel very sedentary because I've hardly been on any planes the last few years. My own evolution was, I was born in 1951, and I was a big Hubert Humphrey fan in 1964. Grew up in a liberal household around Washington, D.C. But in high school, I began to read a little bit of people like Bernard Fall and learning about the Vietnam War. And so I went to my first anti-war march, the one in New York City, April 15th, 1967. And so the Vietnam War really was a catalyst for me as it was for so many people. And I was always interested in journalism. And in this society, being a journalist and being an activist is usually seen as oil and water and antithetical, but actually we have a long tradition of progressive journalists, including George Seldes and Upton Sinclair, and there's many speaking to people in Southern California. Upton Sinclair, great hero, ran for governor in 1934. But anyway, I felt they had a lot of role models, which I think is really important. You know, when I was growing up, I went to talks at a Unitarian church, for instance, of people who had resisted the Vietnam War. They were from the Navy or the U.S. Army, and they were war resistors. And to me, that was very inspiring. And so from that day to this, I've really tried to use my journalistic interest and background and learning and activism. And I have to say that, you know, after writing a dozen books and literally thousands of articles and places like Common Dreams, which I think is just a wonderful website that I read and write for, that whole process is writing a book is really difficult, but organizing is more difficult. You know, I've done a lot of organizing too. And at least when you're writing an article or a book, you can get into a space where you have some control. You have complete control over that frame and what you fill it in with and you work on. Yeah, it's challenging and so forth, but it gives you a sense that you have some control over the elements that you're working with. Organizing is not that way at all. And so we're constantly dealing with so many variables, including, dare I say it, personalities, which aren't always copacetic together. And so to me, writing and organizing have been cross-pollinating and very helpful because one can enrich the other.
Robert Orsini, you had a follow-up.
I just wanted to say that, you know, the great quote from MLK, the United States' greatest purveyor of violence in the world, still holds true. And you know, our military, but our industry, how we function and work in the world creates its own momentum of violence. And we see that everywhere. I mean, all these conflict zones fundamentally are the result of what we've all talked about for so many years about a wayward foreign policy that is out of control and with the semblance of control and stability, NATO or whatever. But no, we have been spreading this kind of instability and chaos in all directions. I have to also remember the invasion of Iraq. It was Putin who let the United States walk right in, perhaps on purpose because he knew it was going to be a disaster for us. But the idea then again is that, you know, it's like we keep thinking we can exert ourselves in this manner, but fundamentally, and this is my last point here, fundamentally the problem is us. The problem is internal. This country is at war with itself right now, as we see in our politics, in every way. It's just this is happening here, and it's also as a result projecting instability everywhere. So my hope and vision, all of us have been all committed to it, is, you know, the process starts here with us before it can go really anywhere else. And I think that is the core of organizing, really, is to get people together, common cause, make good things happen. So those are my comments.
Yeah, thanks for that. I thought of the cliche that unfortunately still fits, you know, in the belly of the beast, or if you will, in the belly of a big beast. I think corporate capitalism is driving virtually all of this one way or the other. And this maximizing of profits and trying to get geopolitical dominance for all sorts of reasons, markets and raw materials and all the rest of that. I think in the last few decades, really a turning point was the bombing of Kosovo and Yugoslavia in 1999, and just this idea that the U.S. can use its air power sometimes under NATO cover, of just doing whatever the hell it wants. And that message, do as we say, not as we do, is not very persuasive. People around the world can see what's happening, and the net result is it sort of spreads. It spreads not only, if you will, role modeling, but also a destruction of any concept of international law. I remember there's some beautiful video of Senator Wayne Morris in 1964 saying that U.S. policy in Southeast Asia, as he put it, is might makes right. And he said he said, it's just as wrong when we do it as when Russia does it. And this whole notion that the U.S. gets to do what it wants and point the finger at other countries, it doesn't make such actions by other countries okay. But the fact that the U.S. government is engaged in such massive hypocrisy is really threatening the future of the world in terms of thermonuclear war. One thing I want to mention as well, as we get close to wrapping up, in this particular era and what has been happening in the Middle East, the merger as never before of US militarism and Zionism is a huge factor. And Zionism is Jewish nationalism. It has merged in with US nationalism and militarism, and it's toxic. And I want to add that it's very clear just by the numbers. The most widespread and really politically powerful force of Zionism in the US is Christian Zionism. There's an organization of Christian Zionists claims 10 million members in the United States. That's more than the 7 million Jews in the country of the United States. And we're going to need to, in the process of working for peace, we're going to need to confront that Zionism is antithetical to justice in the Middle East, and it's antithetical to peace.
Yeah. Dr. Ruby Omar, you had your hand up.
Thank you for all you've expressed and put it together. And the biggest things that I see is our future generations in knowing the unity and the positive trade, and also what annihilation is. So that we want future being able to have the environment working well together. And this includes the plants, and everything, the water and everything. So thank you, Norman, for bringing all those things up. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
No, thank you very much. We are very glad to have had you. You have an open invitation to join us anytime you'd like. And I don't want to steal Mr. Rohde's thunder, but you are, actually, you go ahead.
Norman, you are now a card-carrying member of ICUJP in
Yes.
good standing. Please rejoin us whenever you can. We'll add you to our list. It was an extraordinary presentation today. I'm delighted it's recorded. We will post this, and you and others, and we will spread it far and wide.
Mhm.
Many thanks.